Greetings. This is Father Michael with our word for the week. This week's word is Groundhog, as in Groundhog Day, which is celebrated every year on February 2nd. This year, it's going to be this coming Tuesday. Now, one of my very favorite movies growing up, a real classic, is Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray, who plays a conceited weatherman who is sent on assignment to cover the events and gets snowed in. He gets stuck. And not only is he geographically stuck, but as the movie unfolds, we discover that he's caught this kind of time loop where he has to live the same 24 hours again and again and again. And a lot of the comedy comes from him trying to wrestle with this, kind of figure this out. He goes through those stages of grief, of denial, of bargaining, of becoming angry, and then a kind of giving up, a kind of quiet despair. And in that moment, when he comes to grips with being stuck, there's a pivot point, a turning point, in which he reaches out to someone, a homeless beggar who will freeze on the street. He reaches out in a moment of selflessness. And even though that first act of selflessness does not transform everything, it leads him on a path where by the end of the film, spoiler alert, he has spent 24 hours simply attending to the needs of everyone in that tiny little community. And once he realizes that the secret to happiness is not in what you get, but in how you give of yourself, the cycle is broken. The shadow of selfishness, which had darkened his life, is able to bloom into the springtime of new life, and he's able to go forward. The clock changes. It's now February 3rd. As Christians, we celebrate this Tuesday, not simply Groundhog Day, but the feast of the presentation of the Lord. Oh, it's a wonderful feast. It's 40 days after Christmas, and it remembers that moment when Mary and Joseph bring the baby Jesus to the temple. And in some ways, like Groundhog Day, it is a moment of new beginning, of fresh start. Consider the context. The temple built by Solomon had been destroyed and ultimately is rebuilt, and yet that second temple is missing something very important. And what is that? The Ark of the Covenant. The very living presence of God is missing. And so for over 500 years, this Jewish people waited for the rediscovery of the Ark, or perhaps more to the point, the advent, the coming of an anointed one, of a Messiah who would fill the temple with God's grace and would restore the sacrifices and that act of worship to its fullness as articulated by the covenant. And so Simeon, this priest of the temple, spent a lifelong vigil, every day coming to the temple, waiting for this Ark of the Covenant, waiting for the full presence of God to come. And so when he sees Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus, he is given that inspiration that in this child is the fulfillment of what the Jewish people had been waiting for over 500 years. They'd been stuck in a cycle of absence of God's presence. And in this moment, he takes the child Jesus in his arms and he says, Lord, take me now. I've seen it all. I have seen the fulfillment, the presence, once again, of the Lord here in this temple. It's a return of the Ark of the Covenant, if you will, a fulfillment of that promise. For the Jewish people in this moment, Simeon names the reality, the shadow of absence, of the lack of having the ark, is now made way as the dawn from on high. Christ, who is to be a light of the nations, is able to bring the Lord's light once again into the fulfillment of God's holy people. And so for us, this year 2021, as we turn the page from a disaster of a year, to put it mildly as an understatement, 2020, we find ourselves, perhaps in many areas of our life, just as stuck as we perhaps felt in 2020. Pandemic, vaccine notwithstanding, continues to be in our lives. The shadow of political foment, just the inability to be able to gather in the fullness of community and that physical presence might have our lives still feeling like we're in neutral, we're stuck. This Feast of the Presentation, then, this February 2nd for us might be an invitation to a new start. Ask yourself this question. What areas in my life do I feel stuck in? I feel like I'm just in neutral, not making any headway. It could be that there's a lack of forgiveness on our part. There's a relationship that's hurting or wounded or doesn't seem to find a way forward. Perhaps there's an aspect of our own spiritual life, our relationship with God, which seems at a distance. Perhaps it's our inability to find what is God's will for me in terms of my vocation, in terms of what the Lord is calling me to. I don't have clarity of discernment, or I haven't really summoned the courage to put in those behaviors, those habits, those good habits and growth and virtue. Whatever it is, and as a Dominican, I always look to those 4 qualities of study, of prayer, of community and ministry, and ask myself, am I learning more about God each day? Am I taking time for prayer? Am I connecting with community in all of its ways? Am I ministering? Am I giving of myself? However I'm stuck, this is that moment to say to the Lord, like a New Year's resolution, if you will, redone or reborn, Lord, help me to get unstuck. Lord, give me clarity of mind and the ability to see where perhaps I need to let the winter of the shadow of being stuck in my life dissipate in the strength and the light of your grace. How is it that the Lord is calling you to get unstuck? How is it that you, with God's grace, can move forward in this year 2021 by celebrating this great feast, that feast of the presentation, that feast in which God's presence comes alive in us anew? May indeed the Feast of the Presentation, may these 40 days after Christmas lead us into fresh places, into new aspects of God's grace, that we too might be able to say like Simeon, I have seen the salvation of the Lord. I have seen his light, and I live in his grace. Amen.